The carpet on the Deck 7 corridor of the MS Celestia has this dizzying, repetitive pattern of interlocking teal anchors that I must have stared at for 20 minutes before I realized I wasn't actually getting any closer to my cabin. It was well past 3 in the morning, and the usual late-night hum of the ship had settled into a heavy, pressurized silence that made every heartbeat feel like a dull thud against my ribs. I had spent the evening at the stern bar, perhaps indulging in one too many gin and tonics, but the fog in my head was starting to clear as the sheer length of the hallway began to defy common sense. Every few meters, I passed the same brass wall sconce casting the same sickly yellow pool of light onto the same heavy, cream-colored doors. I remember thinking that the ship's architects must have had a cruel sense of humor, designing a space so devoid of landmarks that a person could easily lose their mind just trying to find room 7142. My footsteps were muffled by the thick pile of the carpet, creating a strange, rhythmic thumping that seemed to echo not behind me, but somewhere deep within the walls themselves. I stopped for a moment to catch my breath and lean against the cool, vibrating surface of the bulkhead, feeling the massive engines of the ship churning miles below my feet. That was when I heard the first sound that didn't belong, the distinct, metallic click of a magnetic lock disengaging. I turned my head slowly, looking back the way I had come, and saw that the door to room 7088 was standing about an inch ajar, a sliver of darkness peering out from the gap. I frowned, thinking perhaps the occupant hadn't pulled it shut properly or that the slight list of the ship had caused the latch to fail. I dismissed it as a minor maintenance fluke and kept walking, my pace quickening just a fraction as the isolation of the hallway began to feel less like privacy and more like abandonment. 10 paces later, another click resonated through the air, sharper and more deliberate than the first one. I didn't even have to turn around this time to know that the door I had just passed, room 7094, had also unlatched itself. A cold prickle of sweat broke out across the back of my neck, and I told myself that the ship's central security system was probably just glitching out, cycling the locks for a reset. I tried to maintain my composure, focusing on the numbers on the doors as they crawled upward. 7096, 7098, 7100. As my shoulder passed the frame of 7100, the lock groaned and the door swung inward by several inches, moving with a smooth, mechanical precision that suggested it was being pushed from the inside. I stopped dead in my tracks, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my sternum as I stared at the dark void of the guest room. There was no light on inside, and the air that drifted out of the cabin smelled faintly of ozone and something sharp, like copper or old pennies. "Hello," I whispered, my voice sounding thin and pathetic in the vast, empty corridor. No one answered, but the silence that followed felt heavy and expectant, as if the ship itself were holding its breath. I decided then that I wasn't going to wait for the next door to open, so I started to jog, my dress shoes slipping slightly on the decorative anchors. Every time I passed a cabin, the sound followed me. Click, creak, click, creak. A mechanical wave of opening doors that shadowed my progress down the hall. I looked back and saw a line of dark gaps stretching into the distance, a dozen doors standing open like the mouths of hungry animals. The dread was no longer a slow burn. It was a roaring fire in my chest that made it hard to draw a full breath. I reached a junction where the hallway should have turned toward the elevators, but instead, it just kept going, the teal anchors and cream doors stretching out into an impossible perspective. I realized with a jolt of pure terror that I hadn't seen a single crew member or another passenger since I left the bar, and the ship felt completely hollowed out. I passed room 7120, and this time the door didn't just crack open. It swung wide, hitting the interior stopper with a muffled thud. I caught a glimpse of movement in the shadows of the room, a tall, thin shape standing perfectly still beside the unmade bed. I didn't stop to look closer, my legs pumping as I sprinted past 7122, 7124, and 7126, the clicks happening faster and faster now, almost overlapping into a single, continuous grinding sound. I could hear the rustle of fabric coming from the rooms I had already passed, the unmistakable sound of multiple people stepping out into the hallway behind me. I refused to look back, terrified that if I saw who was following me, I would lose the will to keep moving. My lungs were burning, and the salt air felt like sandpaper in my throat as I finally saw the door for 7142 looming ahead of me. I fumbled for my keycard, my hands shaking so violently that I nearly dropped the plastic strip onto the floor. I swiped the card through the reader, praying for the green light, but the LED remained stubbornly, mockingly dark. I swiped again, then a third time, sobbing under my breath as the mechanical clicks behind me drew closer and closer. The door to 7140, right next to mine, hissed open, and a pale hand reached out to grip the edge of the frame. It wasn't a monster's hand. It was the hand of a man, wearing a white steward's glove that was stained with something dark and wet. I slammed my shoulder against my door in a fit of desperation, and to my shock, it gave way, the lock having been disengaged from the inside just a second before I hit it. I tumbled into the darkness of my own cabin and scrambled to my feet, slamming the door shut and shoving the deadbolt into place. I leaned my back against the wood, gasping for air, listening to the absolute silence that had returned to the corridor outside. Then, from the darkness of the corner of my room, where the small vanity mirror should be, I heard the sound of a chair scraping against the floorboards. A voice, calm and horribly familiar, spoke from the shadows, barely louder than a whisper. "You really should have stayed at the bar," the voice said, and I realized it was the same bartender who had served me my last drink 20 minutes ago. I looked toward the balcony door and saw that it was locked from the outside, the heavy glass vibrating with the force of the wind. I reached for the light switch, but my hand froze when I felt another hand already resting on top of the plastic toggle. The room didn't feel like my room anymore. It felt like a trap that had been meticulously set hours before I even boarded the ship. I realized then that the hallway hadn't been endless. I had just been steered exactly where they wanted me to go. Outside in the hall, the clicking started again, but this time it was different. It was the sound of 100 doors being locked all at once. I am sitting on the floor now, writing this on a cocktail napkin, because I don't want to look up and see how many of them are standing in the shadows with me. The ship is still moving, the engines are still humming, and somewhere far above, the sun is probably starting to rise over the ocean. But down here on deck 7, the lights have just gone out, and I can hear the sound of someone slowly turning the deadbolt on my door from the other side. They aren't trying to get in anymore. They are making sure I can't get out. I can feel the breath of someone standing directly behind me, smelling of gin and salt water, and I know that the next time the door opens, it won't be for me. The teal anchors on the carpet are the last thing I see before the darkness becomes total, and I realize the MS Celestia was never meant to reach a port. We are just drifting in a loop, and the count is finally complete. I never thought I'd find myself on one of these massive floating cities, especially not alone. But after the year I'd had, a solo cruise through the Caribbean seemed like the only way to finally reset my exhausted brain. The MS Sovereign was a literal behemoth, a white steel mountain that hummed with a low-frequency vibration you could feel in your molars every time you stood still for too long in the corridors. For the first 3 days, everything was exactly as the brochure promised. Bottomless mimosas, the smell of overpriced sunblock, and the constant, polite chatter of Midwestern retirees. By the 4th night, however, I was starting to feel that strange, hollow isolation that only comes from being surrounded by thousands of people you don't actually know. I had retreated to my cabin early to read, but the air conditioning was rattling in a way that made it impossible to concentrate. So I decided to head up to the Lido deck for the midnight bioluminescent gala. The elevators were unusually slow, almost as if they were being held on other floors, so I took the stairs, and listened to the rhythmic thud of my own footsteps echoing against the sterile, white-painted metal. When I finally reached the top deck, the humidity hit me like a wet wool blanket, thick with the scent of salt air and something cloyingly sweet, like overripe tropical fruit left in the sun. The music was already pounding, a heavy, bass-driven house track that seemed to vibrate the very deck chairs against the teak flooring. It was dark, save for the neon blue and purple floodlights that turned the pool water into a glowing, chemical-looking soup. I remember thinking how quiet the crowd was despite the volume of the speakers. There were no shouts, no laughter, just the relentless, mechanical beat of the song. I walked toward the edge of the pool, my sandals clicking softly on the wet wood, and I saw at least 30 people floating in the water. They were all wearing the white linen outfits suggested by the itinerary, and they were drifting lazily in the center of the pool like a patch of pale lilies. I took a seat at the edge of a lounge chair, expecting someone to splash or swim over to the edge, but they all just drifted in the same slow, circular current. The neon lights played tricks on my eyes, making the water look thicker than it should have been, almost viscous. I watched a woman in a white sundress who was floating face up just a few feet away from me. Her hair was spread out around her head like a dark halo, and her eyes were open, staring straight up at the starless sky. I waited for her to blink, or for the tension in her neck to shift as she adjusted her buoyancy, but she remained perfectly still. I leaned forward, my hands gripping the edge of the cool plastic lounge chair, and tried to see the rise and fall of her chest. There was nothing. I shifted my gaze to the man floating next to her, a large fellow with a gold watch that glinted every time the blue light hit it. His mouth was slightly agape, and a small pool of water had collected in the dip of his collarbone, sitting there undisturbed by any movement. I felt a cold prickle of sweat break out across my forehead that had nothing to do with the tropical heat. I looked around the deck, searching for the party I had heard from the stairwell, but the lounge chairs were occupied by people who were just as still. There was a couple sitting at a nearby table with 2 half-full martinis, their bodies slumped slightly forward as if they were sharing a deep, whispered secret. I walked over to them, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird, and cleared my throat to ask if they were okay. They didn't move, and as I got closer, I realized the woman's hand was resting on the table in a way that looked unnaturally stiff, her fingers slightly blue at the tips. I reached out, my hand trembling, and brushed my fingers against the man's shoulder. He felt like a piece of chilled marble, his skin devoid of the warmth that should have been there after a day in the Caribbean sun. I pulled my hand back as if I'd been burned, stumbling away from the table and nearly tripping over a pair of discarded flip-flops. The music was still blaring, the same 4-bar loop repeating over and over again, and I realized it wasn't a live DJ at all, but a recording played at an ear-splitting volume. I looked back at the pool and noticed something I had missed before. Thin, translucent wires were attached to the ankles of the floating guests, anchored to the bottom of the pool to keep them from drifting into the sides. This wasn't a party. It was a display, a carefully choreographed scene of domestic vacation bliss staged with corpses. I turned toward the glass doors leading back to the interior of the ship, but I saw a shadow move behind the tinted windows. It wasn't the white uniform of a steward or the casual wear of a tourist, but something dark and utilitarian. I realized then that I hadn't seen a single member of the crew since I left my cabin 20 minutes ago. The silence of the guests suddenly became deafening, even over the roar of the speakers, because I knew that if 30 people were in the pool and dozens more were on the deck, the rest of the ship couldn't be far behind. I crept toward the railing, thinking I could maybe find a life station or a radio, but the lifeboats were already gone, their empty davits swinging rhythmically with the motion of the ship. The Sovereign felt lighter, as if it were riding higher in the water than it had been this afternoon, and the engine seemed to be idling at a much lower frequency. I looked down into the dark ocean below, and for a second, I thought I saw white shapes bobbing in the wake, trailing behind the ship like a macabre breadcrumb trail. A sudden, sharp metallic click echoed from the direction of the bridge, and I froze, pressing my back against the cold steel of the railing. I heard voices then, not the frantic shouting of an emergency, but the calm, coordinated tones of men who were finishing a long day's work. One of them laughed, a short, dry sound that was quickly swallowed by the wind. I realized that the midnight gala was a cover, a way to keep anyone who might still be hiding in their cabins from coming up and seeing the deck before it was set. My mind raced through the last few hours, remembering the weirdly bitter taste of the water in my cabin and the way the hallway lights had flickered before I left. They must have put something in the ship's supply, something to make the transition quiet and orderly. I looked at the woman in the pool again, and this time I saw the small, surgical incision at the base of her neck, neatly closed with a single black stitch. These people hadn't just died. They were being preserved, prepared for whatever purpose this new crew had for a ship full of human cargo. I ducked behind a stack of folded towels as a flashlight beam swept across the deck, illuminating the pale, unblinking faces of the guests in the water. The light lingered on the couple at the table, checking to make sure their pose hadn't been disturbed by the wind. I felt a sob rising in my throat and bit down on my knuckles to keep from making a sound. I was the only thing on this deck that was still breathing, the only living heartbeat in a sea of synthetic stillness. I looked at the stairs I had come up, but the door was now being propped open by a man carrying a heavy plastic crate. He was wearing a gray jumpsuit and a respirator mask, his movements efficient and devoid of any hesitation. He walked over to the pool and began tossing small, heavy tablets into the water, which hissed and bubbled as they sank to the bottom. The smell of chlorine intensified, becoming so sharp it made my eyes water, masking that sweet, underlying rot I had noticed earlier. I realized then that they weren't just keeping the bodies. They were treating the water to keep the display from deteriorating too quickly. I began to crawl along the edge of the railing, hoping to find a service hatch or a vent that would lead me down to the lower decks where the engines were. If I could get to the engine room, maybe I could find a way to signal for help, or at least disable the ship so it wouldn't reach its next destination. But as I rounded the corner of the bar, I saw another man standing by the railing, staring out at the horizon with a pair of binoculars. He wasn't looking for other ships. He was looking for the trail of waste they had left behind to ensure no one was following them. I pressed myself as flat as I could against the floor, the damp wood soaking into my shirt, and waited for him to turn around. My hand brushed against something cold and metallic under the bar, and I realized it was a handheld radio, likely dropped by a crew member during the initial takeover. I fumbled for the power button, my fingers slick with sweat, and felt a tiny vibration as the screen flickered to life. I didn't dare bring it to my ear, so I turned the volume down to the lowest possible setting and held it against my cheek. All I heard was static, a harsh, jagged noise that sounded like sandpaper on bone. Then a voice came through, clear and cold. "Deck 12 is set. We're moving to the staterooms for the final collection now." I realized with a jolt of pure terror that they weren't done, and that my cabin was no longer a sanctuary but a trap. I looked back at the pool one last time, and the blue light caught the eyes of the floating guests, making them look like they were watching me. I knew then that there was no help coming from the sea, and the ship was no longer a vessel of vacation, but a floating gallery of the dead. I turned the radio off and began to climb over the railing, my feet dangling over the churning black abyss of the Atlantic. I didn't know if I would survive the fall, or if the sharks would get to me before the hypothermia did. But as I looked back at the man with the binoculars, I knew that being lost at sea was a better fate than becoming part of their collection. I took a deep breath, the salt air stinging my lungs, and let go of the cold metal. As I fell, the last thing I heard wasn't the wind or the waves, but the rhythmic thumping of that house music, still playing for an audience that would never hear it again. The water was colder than I expected, a shocking, violent embrace that sucked the air out of my chest instantly. I drifted down into the darkness, looking up at the glowing hull of the MS Sovereign as it continued its silent journey across the ocean. From below, the pool lights looked like a shimmering purple eye, watching the surface for any sign of life. I kicked my legs, fighting the urge to just let the current take me, and wondered how many more ships like this were out there, drifting through the night. The silence of the deep was finally broken by the muffled, distant thump of the base, a heartbeat for a ship that was already dead. I began to swim away from the lights, my arms heavy and my vision blurring as the cold began to take hold. I saw a life ring bobbing a few dozen yards away, likely tossed over by someone who had the same idea I did. I reached for it, my fingers numb and unresponsive, and managed to hook my arm through the center. I looked back at the ship, which was now just a silhouette against the stars, a ghost ship carrying its silent passengers to a port that didn't exist on any map. I was alone in the middle of the ocean, with nothing but a plastic ring and the memory of those unblinking eyes in the blue water. I closed my eyes and prayed for a light on the horizon, but all I could see was the purple glow of the midnight gala. The night was far from over, and I knew that the real horror wasn't what was in the water with me, but what was still on that ship. I waited for the sun to rise, but the sky remained a deep, impenetrable black, as if the world itself had ended the moment I stepped onto that deck. I am still floating here, and the music has finally stopped, leaving only the sound of the waves and my own jagged, terrified breathing. Somewhere in the distance, I think I hear the hum of another engine, and I don't know whether to scream for help or hide, because in this part of the ocean, you never know if the ship coming to save you is just looking for more guests for the party. There is no one left to tell the story of the MS Sovereign, only the things that are left drifting in its wake. I can feel my grip on the life ring slipping as the waves get higher, and the cold is finally starting to feel like sleep. I hope the next person who finds this cruise ship looks at the pool before they decide to jump in. I hope they notice the wires and the stillness and the way the lights don't reflect in the guests' eyes. But mostly, I hope they realize that the most dangerous thing on a ship isn't the water or the storm, but the people who decided the party should never end. My lungs are heavy now, and the water is calling, and I think I see a white dress floating toward me in the dark. It's the woman from the pool, her hair spread out like a halo, and she's finally moving, carried by the same current that's taking me. She isn't breathing, but in the dark, it almost looks like she's reaching out to hold my hand. I close my eyes and let the ocean take the rest of the air I have left. The gala is over, and it's time for the final dance. I just hope I'm not the only one left who remembers what it felt like to be warm. The stars are fading now, or maybe it's just my eyes, but the water is finally still. And in the silence, I can finally hear the ocean breathing for all of us. The salt air on the top deck usually carries a sense of freedom, but tonight it felt heavy, almost metallic, as if the ocean itself was holding its breath. I stood by the railing, watching the wake of the ship churn into a dark, frothy void that seemed to swallow the moonlight whole. There were 3,000 people on this vessel, yet the silence out here made me feel like I was the only soul left on the planet. I tapped my glass against the cold steel, listening to the rhythmic thrum of the engines below my feet, a sound that usually lulled me to sleep, but tonight felt like a strained, gasping heartbeat. The first announcement from the bridge came through the public address system at exactly 2:14 a.m., cutting through the night like a serrated blade. Captain Miller's voice, usually a soothing, baritone rumble, sounded thin and frayed at the edges, crackling with static interference that hadn't been there during the daily briefings. He told us there was a minor navigation discrepancy due to a localized magnetic anomaly, and that all passengers should remain in their cabins for their own comfort, while the crew recalibrated the systems. I laughed it off, leaning back against the cool plastic of a lounge chair and finishing the last of my warm gin and tonic. It was just bureaucracy, the kind of corporate speak meant to keep the buffet lines moving and the casino chips flowing without a hitch. I walked down the spiral staircase, the carpet muffling my footsteps until the hallways began to look like an endless, repeating photograph of cream-colored walls and gold-trimmed doors. The air inside the ship smelled faintly of ozone and old, recirculated dust, a sharp contrast to the biting cold of the open sea. I reached my cabin, fumbled with my keycard, and collapsed onto the bed, staring up at the acoustic tiles that pulsed slightly with the vibrations of the ship. I must have drifted off for an hour, because the next announcement jolted me awake so violently that I tumbled onto the floor. This time, the captain wasn't using the polite, pre-recorded script. His breathing was labored, hitching in the speakers, as if he were running a marathon through a cramped crawl space. He warned us not to look out our portholes, his voice rising into a jagged, unnatural pitch that set my teeth on edge. He insisted that the stars were in the wrong position, and that the GPS coordinates had begun to display strings of numbers that didn't belong in any language he recognized. I sat on the carpet, clutching my phone, but there was no signal, just a flat, dead line where the bars should have been. I tried the television, but it was just snow shifting patterns that looked like swarming insects in the dim light of the cabin. My heart began to hammer against my ribs, a dull, aching thud that drowned out the humming of the ship. I realized then that the engines had changed their tune. The smooth, metallic whine had been replaced by a slow, grinding crunch, like bones being crushed between iron plates. I walked to the door and pressed my ear against the wood, waiting to hear the familiar shuffling of feet or the chatter of late-night travelers in the corridor. There was absolutely nothing, not even the mechanical click of the hallway climate control, just a profound, suffocating void. The lights in the cabin flickered once, twice, and then settled into a sickly, yellow dimness that cast long, distorted shadows across my luggage. I felt a sudden, sharp prickle of sweat at the base of my neck, the primal realization that the air felt stale, as if the ventilation system had been cut off hours ago. I looked toward the small, circular window that looked out onto the outer deck, fighting the urge to obey the captain's frantic, desperate order. The ship lurched, a sickening tilt that sent my chair skidding across the room and crashing into the minibar with a splintering sound. I scrambled to the window, wiped the condensation away with my sleeve, and pressed my face against the freezing glass. There was no horizon, no distant glow of land, and no reflection of the ship's lights on the black water below. Instead, the surface of the ocean looked like vast, stretched leather, completely motionless and devoid of waves. I backed away, my breath hitching in my throat, when the intercom clicked back on with a sound like wet gravel being ground in a mortar. The captain was crying now, his voice reduced to a ragged, incoherent whisper that barely reached the speakers. He told us that he had gone down to the engine room to find out why we were stalling, but there were no engineers there. He said he had walked all the way to the bow, but the bow was gone, replaced by an infinite, expanding wall of gray mist that seemed to be eating the ship one deck at a time. He begged for someone to come to the bridge, to take the wheel, to talk to him. But his words ended in a sudden, wet choking sound that cut off into a deafening silence. I stood in the middle of my cabin, paralyzed by the realization that the silence wasn't just in the halls, it was everywhere. I reached for the door handle, my hand trembling so hard I could barely grasp the metal, and pushed it open an inch. The hallway was dark, illuminated only by the faint, flickering red of an emergency exit sign at the far end of the corridor. A single shoe, a woman's high-heeled pump, sat perfectly upright in the middle of the carpet, as if its owner had simply stepped out of it and vanished into the ether. I stepped out into the hall, my heart racing so fast it made me lightheaded, and began to walk toward the bridge. The further I went, the more the ship felt like a tomb, the ornate decorations and plush carpets looking garish and hollow in the dying light. I passed cabin doors that were standing wide open, revealing rooms that looked untouched, beds made perfectly, televisions still playing their silent, snowy static. I reached the service elevator and pressed the button, but it was dead, the light behind the plastic casing long since burned out. I started up the stairs, my legs burning with the effort, the air growing colder with every flight I ascended. By the time I reached the 5th deck, the ship began to groan, a structural protest that sounded like a giant tearing a sheet of metal in half. I looked down the stairwell, down into the dark abyss of the lower levels, and saw something that froze the blood in my veins. There were footprints on the stairs below me, wet, heavy, and spaced out, appearing one by one in the dust as if someone invisible was climbing right behind me. I didn't look back, I didn't breathe, I just ran, my footsteps sounding like cannon fire in the tomb-like silence of the stairwell. I reached the bridge access door and found it slightly ajar, the heavy steel gate swaying rhythmically with the subtle, unnatural swaying of the ship. I pushed it open and stumbled into the bridge, expecting to find the captain, expecting to find chaos, expecting to find anything other than what I saw. The bridge was pristine, the navigation screens glowing with a soft, steady blue light, the radar showing a calm sea and a clear path toward the harbor. But there was no one in the captain's chair, no one at the helm, and the throttles were pushed all the way forward into a position they shouldn't have been able to reach. I walked to the main window, the one that offered a panoramic view of the bow and the open ocean, and felt my knees buckle. We weren't in the ocean anymore. We were perched on the edge of something else, a vast, swirling expanse of white fog that held no depth and no substance. I turned to look back at the room and saw my own reflection in the darkened console, but behind me, in the doorway I had just passed through, a man was standing. He was wearing the captain's uniform, but his face was perfectly smooth. No eyes, no nose, no mouth, just an expanse of pale, stretched skin. He wasn't moving, he wasn't breathing. He was just standing there, his head tilted at an impossible, broken angle. He raised a finger to where his lips should have been, a gesture that was at once a warning and a command for me to stay silent. I looked down at the console and saw the PA system switch blinking, a tiny, rhythmic pulse of red that matched the beat of my own heart. I didn't touch it, I didn't move. I just watched as the man in the uniform slowly began to glide across the floor toward me, his feet making no sound at all. The ship groaned again, a deep, final thrum that felt like the hull finally giving up the ghost against the pressure of the nothingness. I closed my eyes, but the sound of the PA system clicking on filled the bridge, a distorted, high-pitched static that suddenly settled into a familiar, calm, and terrifyingly polite voice. It wasn't the captain anymore. It was my own voice, clear as a bell, reading the next announcement. It told the passengers that everything was perfectly normal, that the destination had been reached, and that we were all requested to gather on the main deck for a special final departure. I heard the door to the bridge creak open again, and then the sound of dozens of footsteps, rhythmic and heavy, marching in perfect unison toward the console. I stood there, trapped between the void outside and the something that was filling the room, listening to my own voice invite the rest of the ship to their end. I don't know who is going to hear this, or if the radio is even transmitting anymore, but the door is opening wider now. The man with no face is standing right next to me, and he smells like the deepest, coldest part of the sea. I think I'm going to follow the instructions, because the silence outside is starting to sound like it's finally waiting for me to step out.